All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to say good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Good afternoon to our friends on the East Coast, and welcome to everyone in between. I am Leslie Garvin from North Carolina Campus Engagement, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today for Moving Beyond Policy. Practical Considerations for Reforming Promotion and Tenure, featuring Dr. Emily Janke. And it's our hope and our intention that she's going to share some in-depth insights and learnings from the past 15 years about how the University of North Carolina at Greensboro has tackled promotion and tenure reform. I think we're all experts in Zoom now, but as a reminder, we ask that you remain muted, and we are, of course, recording this session. You have the option of turning on closed captioning if you want to, and it is, of course, in the menu. And this recording is going to be made available on the Lead California website. And we are going to, of course, send a link to the video as well as an evaluation in the follow-up email that will go to all the registrants. So our agenda for today is that we are going to have Emily Janke share for about 45 minutes, and then we are going to open up our time for question and answer. So we invite you to post your questions in the chat. There's obviously also a Q&A option as well as we go along. We want to thank those of you that already submitted questions when you registered, and it is our intention to get to as many of those as we can get to. So I am excited to say that this is the newest webinar in a series that Lead California, North Carolina Campus Engagement, and the Collaboratory launched. We really felt that promotion and tenure and community engagement continues to be a key topic that our campuses are wrestling with, and we thought that this would be wonderful to spend some time with a campus that has done well in this area. I want you to know and foreshadow that we are planning to have another webinar coming up in February, but our previous webinar that was on February 13th, Re-envisioning Publicly Engaged Scholarship in Promotion and Tenure, that featured Dr. Tim Eatman, David Donahue, and Emily Janke, can now be found on the Lead California website and their YouTube channel. And I believe we'll be putting a link in the chat for folks that want to see that first webinar. I also want to share that we will be hosting the webinar in February on the 5th, and it is about promising promotion and tenure reforms for societally impactful research, strategies, and opportunities. And essentially is going to be focusing on an upcoming report, the Pew Transforming Evidence Funders Network report. And so we invite you to be on the lookout for information about that. And on April 16th, we are going to have a webinar with a panel featuring folks discussing departmental integration. So it is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Janke, our featured speaker. I have had the privilege of knowing Emily since she began working at UNC Greensboro back in 2008. I have always found her to be a brilliant practitioner scholar who is thoughtful, strategic, and very effective as a leader, and with a genuine passion for equitable and impactful community engagement. Dr. Janke has served as the director of the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement since 2010, where she has supported UNC Greensboro transformation as a community engaged university. She is also a professor in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department, where she contributes to its community engaged scholarship through teaching, research, and service. I could go on about the numerous accolades that she's received for her outstanding work, but relevant to our partnership here, she's also a co-author of Collaboratory, which is a publicly searchable online database. And so I am going to turn it over to Emily. Emily, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this really important series. It's a really special time, I think, for me to be able to reflect on the work that I've done at UNCG. So I've been at UNCG, as Leslie said, since 2008. And this has been work that I have not done alone. Folks like Leslie and the work of now North Carolina Campus Engage have been instrumental to much of the work. So the things I'm going to share today are not mine alone. I'm sharing much of the work and the scholarship of people who are on this call, who are on many of the papers, and who have really been instrumental to the field. And I'm indebted to the field for helping to make these kinds of changes I'm going to talk about at UNC Greensboro, or University of North Carolina, Greensboro. I'll just refer to it as UNCG. I also want to be sure to thank not only Leslie Garvin, Elaine Ikeda, and Kristen Medlin for inviting me to do this work, and the other staff that are facilitating this, but also Madeline Kujabi, who's helped me to design a lot of the slides that you're going to see and a lot of the work that we're doing. And so making us look good is one of the things that she's able to do for us. And I also want to thank our families and the web of relationships that we are each in that allow us to be able to sit here at this webinar today to listen wherever we may be, because it certainly means that someone helped for us to get food into our bodies and be nourished. Somebody's helped take care of other people that we care for during this time so that we can be sitting here and present. I also want to acknowledge ancestors who have had many good and bad days so that we could get to this moment. And so I recognize your time is very precious, and that we're doing this work because it is meaningful to us and to the communities that we serve. And so I just want to make sure that we're rooted in acknowledgement of the relationships that we're in and what that web means to us in this very moment as we sit here. I came to UNCG, as I said, 2008. I think it's helpful for me to share a little bit about my own perspective as a scholar administrator, practitioner, scholar. I came as an assistant director for service learning in 2008, straight out of my PhD program. And so I was a staff member for the first 4 years, in which I will be talking about the UNCG's journey. And I think that's really important because it highlights the role that staff members can play in promotion and tenure in terms of being informed, confidants, friends, somebody who can wake up every day thinking about how to advance community engagement on your institution, while many other people have multiple different roles. So I want to highlight that in case that gets lost. And then I am now, since 2012, both director and now a full professor in peace and conflict studies at UNCG. And so I've tipped into a dual role. And so that's given me some views from the inside and some capability, but I'll try to share a little bit about those roles, because I think that really matters a lot for the conversations that you may have on your campus about who can do what and what kinds of roles do we have. Because I think often we point fingers and say, oh, if only the leadership would take over, we could get stuff done, or if only the faculty would rise up, we could get things done. And so I want to acknowledge that. So I'm going to share my screen and go into a bit of a deep dive about UNCG's journey in the last 15 years and what that might mean for your campuses and what we've learned. So it's helpful to know a little bit about UNCG. We are in North Carolina. We're in a metropolitan university of a small size city of about a little less than 300,000 residents. We are a 4-year high research activity institution. And we're also a minority serving institution, which we became in 2017, as now 50% of our students are students of color. We have about 18,000 students. 50% of them are Pell eligible, 36% are first gen. So we've had a lot of changes in our population since we started in 1892 as a women's college. Our faculty are split really 50-50 in terms of what we call tenure track and academic professional track. And as you can see, we have a number of majors, minors, PhD programs, master's programs, undergrad programs. Trying to get it to go. There we go. So when I talk about promotion and tenure, people usually ask, how did we get here? What happened that you could even like touch a document as difficult to touch? And interestingly, we haven't touched it. We haven't revised it since 2010. So it was a really special moment that the policy was changed. So I arrived in 2008. That was the year that faculty, there were some champions of community engagement, including 2 consecutive faculty chairs, who one of them created a faculty senate committee or charged the faculty senate committee on promotion and tenure to look at community engaged scholarship and to make some recommendations to the university. So certainly there were the right people at the right time in terms of faculty champions. We also had many grassroots faculty, including several who worked as service learning fellows who took on 1 year of study and picked a topic. And one of them was Spoma Jovanovic, who was able to look at community engaged scholarship and write a letter to her dean that eventually went on to the provost that was recommending and outlining kind of the issues around community engaged scholarship and why it needs to be recognized in promotion and tenure. And then there is another study that I conducted with a colleague that was 15 faculty members who are community engaged scholarship to find out more about what their experiences were. So there are a number of grassroots faculty, there were faculty champions, and then we also had both UNC system as well as UNCG leadership that really came on board with interest in understanding how community engagement and community engaged scholarship could be part of our distinctive identity and reason for the citizens of North Carolina to fall in love with their institutions of higher education. And of course, this is also 2008. That was the first time that UNCG received its Carnegie classification. That was the second time that was offered. It was first offered in 2006. So this is also a time when definitions and books and there's more capacity, journals, that kind of thing for community engagement. So those are a lot of the national conversations and also the resources. Okay, so a little bit about the university policy. So part of, at UNCG, we have policies at the university, the unit or college or school or department level. So all told, we have something like 67 policies. So when the faculty senate worked on the policy, they were working on the university level. And what happened is they were looking at the policy as it was written. And I'm going to read just a quote from one of the emails from the chair of the faculty senate saying how they thought about it. And so she said, I wanted to let you know how we approached our task, hoping it serves to explain some of the choices we made. First, we decided on a simple rather than complex approach, adding and revising rather than completely overhauling the documents. This approach rested on the idea that often quite small changes yield big differences. We also did not want to imply that traditional scholarship would no longer be valued or valued as highly, and tried to situate community engaged scholarship as another way of conducting the work of the academy, of equal value, but not supplanting other forms of research. That said, we also wanted to make clear that community engaged scholarship may follow a different trajectory than traditional scholarship, and this understanding should guide both the development of the dossiers and the assessment by faculty and committees. And so as faculty, so as the Senate was looking at, or the subcommittee was looking at this, they were really looking at, they're battling with one of the issues of folks being worried that now everybody's going to have to do community engaged scholarship. And the other concern of how do you define this? What does this look like? And how do you kind of squeeze this in and not upset the whole thing? One of the key things in our policy that I think is really helpful is that we do define a scholarship. And scholarship is broadly defined in a way that includes all forms of scholarly work, including teaching, research, creative activity, service, and professional activity. And so this is a statement that is in our policy already. It was not something created by this task force, but it was an important piece because it was helping, and it will come through in this presentation more, the idea that our work is integrated, and that that when we do scholarly work, we do it through all of our different roles, through using our expertise. As part of the Faculty Senate discussion, so in this initial kind of view, there was that initial group that looked at it, presented policy recommendations, and then there was a full discussion of the Faculty Senate. When the full Faculty Senate were speaking, I attended as a staff member listening. They talked about what kind of terms should be used, should community engagement be defined. One of the things that they chose at that time was not to define community engagement, but instead to list the types of activities that one might be able to see under community engaged research and creative activity, for example. So this was the same format that was used in the previous one. Sorry, to talk about other kinds of research and dissemination or research activities. The policy was not, the community engagement was not defined because at that meeting, the provost said, we don't define other forms of scholarship. We might be getting ourselves into trouble if we start to try to define community engagement more rigorously, in a more focused way than we do other forms of scholarship. So let's just leave that out. So that was one of the choice points at that time. And again, this all comes into the story in the study. So this is so this slide shows that in the university policy, UNCG chose to integrate community engagement into each of the 3 categories. So each of our sections: teaching, research and creative activity, as well as service. And so we have within those sections, community engagement is articulated. And this is an example of the research activity and the full extent of what is in there right now for community engagement. And so it is really describing artifacts and outputs, writing papers, exhibits, programs, events, those kinds of things. And again, this was mirroring. So at this time, it was mirroring what was really in there for other kinds of scholarship. So it's helpful to see that this is what was created throughout all 3 sections. So this is just a little bit more information, and folks will have access to the slides afterwards. But again, we were really focused on, like, what would this look like? Like, how would I know what this is? Because that was really the concern at that time. So in 2010, spring of 2010 is when the faculty voted, and they changed the policy. And the policy was what you saw. Our policy is also online if you wanted to take a look at that. But then, so that initial work was done. And then John Saltmarsh and George Mahaffey came to UNCG, as we are an ASCU member campus, and they came and visited, and they said, oh, wow, this is really great. So the rubber meets the road when you get to the department. So what have you done to change the department policies? And so part of that conversation and the work that was done after that was not about the policy, not only the department policies, but it was also about culture change. And they said it can be in the policy, but can also not make it into practice. So that was a real recognition of, oh, okay, the work's not done. And that's where, whereas I was not a faculty member at that time, and I couldn't be a part of those votes, I wasn't in that subcommittee, I didn't have any control over what got written. I didn't even really see it until it was at those final stages. Now, as a special assistant for community engagement, now in the Office of Research and Economic Development, right, in the Chief Research Office, I now had a position to be able to support strategic planning and what does excellence for community engagement looks like. we were able to start to develop communications and websites and start to curate some information, which I'm sharing with you as well, because that's one of the things that we do is we curate things for our scholars so they don't have to go find it. And then collaboratory was our way of helping us understand who was doing what, where, with whom, to what ends across our university as an institutional portrait, because we realized that if we were doing this policy change, we also needed to help believe, or we need to help our institution really believe in our identity as a community engaged campus. And so if we are a community engaged campus, we ought to act like one. And so we needed people to be able to see all those different folks out there. And so we did a number of things throughout this. And so there was so from 2010 to 2012 is when I said there were 67 policies. That's when 66 of those policies were asked to be aligned, is what the word was used by the provost. And a lot of that work was done over about 18 months. And so during that time, I was brought into the provost has a monthly meeting with all the academic deans. And so the provost was putting forward that charge and saying, it's time for us to integrate community engagement into the unit and department level policies. And there were a few new deans who weren't there the year before, and other deans who were sort of like, okay, like I didn't really pay attention, I think, as much as I ought to have to that change in P&T. So like, what is community engagement and how are we supposed to support it? And so that is when the provost looked to me and said, hey, could you help us create some definitions that we could bring back, and that would be helpful for the operationalization, this movement into these other policies. And so at that time, I worked with Patty Clayton and Terry Shelton and a number of other scholars to help go to the national conversations, right? So this is where we have a field. A lot of folks who are not in the field of community engagement, who might not be on this call, don't realize that there's a number of studies and resources and support that we can go to and access. So that's where we started to collect these definitions and created what we call now a definitions document. And it was a 9-page paper. And that paper had the purpose and the terms of the definitions, common standards for all type of scholarship, as described by Glassick, Huber, and Maroff, 1997 publication, as well as the history and contemporary context of the strategic university planning initiatives at UNCG and how community engagement was part of this. So we didn't just define it, we provided the context for why this was important and how this definition came to be. In that letter was also the expectation, the stated expectation that each unit and department would craft language that honors the core principles of community engagement while using terms and examples that best embody the disciplines represented. And so the sense was that, hey, the university policy is a broad policy, but then at the unit level, the department disciplinary levels, you're starting to have more specific contextualization, which is the reason why our campus has them. Now, not every campus has policies. Not every campus is able to have a faculty senate do this work. Many are unionized, and so this is a union contract and negotiation. But all of this is to say that there is opportunity beyond even the policy for other staff, for other faculty collaborators to be able to bring to bear national resources and start to create your own supplementary materials that might be helpful. And the letter also referenced that definition of scholarship earlier on, talking about that scholarship is not synonymous with research, but is really encompassing teaching, research, creative activities, and service. All right, so part of what I shared with you is that, to create culture change, we created not only community engagement terms, and we posted them on the website. They're on the Provost website. They're on the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement website. They're in publications, and we created a special volume that's on our website that is about those definitions. And then there's also the letter that went to faculty, department chairs, and academic deans about these definitions. The second really key part that I would say is really beyond the policy is that we oftentimes, I guess there's two strategies. One is to take people off campus, right? So you can take people to a national conference or an association and let them see how there are other brilliant people out here who we ought to be listening to and hearing from. So some of that work was taking back administrators off campus. One of them is the Engagement Academy for University Leaders. And that was very transformative for a number of our leaders. However, there was like 4 of us, I think, who went, right? And so 4 of us got to go away for 3-4 days. And we, drank the Kool-Aid and we got all the information. And then I thought, wait, there's like thousands of people back. There's 900 faculty back here at UNCG who need to have this information, ideally, right? So then the idea was, okay, let's invest our resources and our funds in bringing these people to UNCG over the course of several years. And so we had a really focused campaign of bringing various people to talk about community engagement as a strategy for transformation, what it looks like as a department, how is this an institutional strategy to support priorities around student success or full participation, anchor institutions. And so that was one of the things that I think has really helped to create a different culture, was that we were sharing that and having conversations, so that literally hundreds of people and folks sitting on promotion and tenure reviews were able to see this work, as well as deans having conversations with some of these scholars and being able to ask them the hard questions. The final part is also beyond the policy, is documenting the path and the progress. And so one of the things that we've been committed to is that we're not going to have a Groundhog's Day over and over again, where folks are doing this work and we make this incremental change, right? And then somebody new comes in and they say, I don't know about community engagement. And it sort of can stop there, right? Because they can just say, I don't know. And then it stopped, just sort of like the dean's conversation stopped when they didn't have the definitions. And they said, okay, well, we need definitions. So these are ways, and this really helping to preserve the conversation, to have institutional learning or organizational learning, where we can start to identify what are the topics that come up, right? Like, who did we bring to campus and what did they say? So that's volume 1, is actually documenting the dialogue of all those people that we brought as speakers. The mosaic of scholarship was documenting the process of our promotion and tenure reform and what were some of the hot spots or the issues that people were worried about. It was the 3-bucket problem of, oh my gosh, I have to describe my community engaged scholarship in separate buckets of teaching, research, and service. And it's so integrated, right? So that got elevated as an issue in that mosaic. And so we'll talk again about how that's still often an issue for folks. And then volume 3 was the third one, was looking at institutional priorities with a new leadership, with a new chancellor who had come in after all this had been done, and to understand how is community engagement a strategy for our institution. So again, all of this work is continuing just to build and build. And so this is the work that folks who are engaged offices get to do. And I need to tell you too that so in our office, there has been myself as there's been usually maybe 2 full-time staff or 1.5 often, and then working with working with graduate students. So this work doesn't require a huge budget, a huge staff, but what it does require is I think persistence and just documentation. And then when the time and the resources are right, you hurry and you put it together and you get the materials together and you help preserve it. But having someone who can wake up every day thinking about community engagement is critical. So having staff is critical. And I would also say that the speaker series couldn't have happened from the the faculty senate. The first couple of people were paid for by the chair of the faculty senate who had a budget, but she didn't have time, right? She didn't have the connections. And so she needed to know who are the people that we should bring to campus, and I'll help recruit them, but I really need you to do that. So I just want to raise that in terms of beyond the policy. So it is now 2023. And so we've been working and doing all this work at UNCG. And so I had the fantastic opportunity to work with some colleagues across several studies to figure out, like, what have we done? Okay, so where are we and what would we do differently if we could turn back time, or in this case, make any recommendations or suggestions to others who are thinking about revising promotion and tenure in their own policies or creating institutional change. And so there are essentially 4 research questions that we've been asking. And so the first 3 are ones that are part of a larger study that I conducted with John Saltmarsh, Isabel Jenkins, and Melissa Kwan. And so these studies were looking at the policies themselves. So, like, what was in those policies after all? Could we go collect them? So what we found is that we had to go back to the different departments and units in a lot of cases to get the policies, because they weren't all held in one spot, which surprised me, because I thought, oh, they're institutional policies, they should all be in one spot. So one of the things that is kind of a lesson learned is to learn more about how policies work on your campus, where they're held, who reviews them, those kinds of things. So we collected those policies, and then we wanted to understand how is community engagement integrated into promotion tenure guidelines. If we said we were going to do this, what did we do? What terms were used? What sections were the terms integrated into? And then how are those terms described and defined? So, like, was it community engagement after all? So as we, okay, let me change. Okay. So we started looking at some of the policies. And so these are just some examples of what we found. So we found that one department had a really good, thick description of community engagement in teaching. And so they provide a definition, they talked about reciprocity and the types of audiences or outcomes, and they even have also a list of outputs or outcomes, which is very representative of what the university policy looked like in terms of here's examples. But they also added this other context above, which was never in the university policy. Other examples we found were in other sections, research and creative activities, talking about how this differentiates, that it's with audiences beyond academic peers, that they often culminate in products other than the academic monograph. And then others had some examples of terms and definitions in their introductory statement. So we're like, oh, great. Okay, so like check, it's there, right? Well, is what is described in each of the policies really community engagement? Like, can I tell if a product is community engaged just by knowing that the product exists? Like, we created a white paper? No, there's some things you need to know. So that's when we went and then we were also looking at the policies. And as we were coding for, okay, any community engagement or like public facing term, right? Anything that feels like it could be, facing another, talking about community engagement. And so the bottom right or left corner is the university document. And in that one, it is showing that we had these different terms in there, but the red ones are the ones that were the headers. And then the other terms sort of came up in some other spots. Then we went to the unit, and then we did the same thing. And we found that within the unit document that the terms from the university document were repeated, but more showed up that were unique to the unit document. And then in the department documents, we found even more So there's 77 terms across all the documents. And this is just a reminder that the unit documents and the department documents were revised often at the same time. And so there wasn't sort of a lockstep necessarily across the university as prescribed by the provost or anyone. And so those two were using that. One of the things that we were finding was there is a lot more context provided than the university document. Where did that come from? So we also looked in our study at that definitions document. So I talked to you about the importance of having these other materials that were curated and developed specifically for our campus and then shared really intentionally with leadership and folks. Our speaker series, that felt like that was starting to show up across the other policies as well. So some of the findings from this question about like what terms do we use is that we looked at recurring root words. And so we saw, yep, community engaged is in a lot of the policies, almost all the policies talked about community engagement rather than, for example, public scholarship, right? Which might be the term that's used on another campus. And so we looked at the different policies and the terms used. We also found, again, that sort of explosion or the proliferation of terms at the department level. And then when we looked at the frequency of terms across policy levels, like so types of like teaching, research, service, we also found that community engaged scholarship or research had more definitions or conceptions or statements about community engagement than we did in the teaching. And I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so when we think about choosing terms, sort of like how does this help you on your campus? So moving kind of from left to right, so that what we found is, yep, there's a proliferation of terms and there are very inconsistent approaches in defining community engaged scholarship. So now what? What we've realized is that it would have been helpful to review policies to ensure true alignment to community engagement standards, regardless of terms. So while departments are going to want to, if it is in their, if you have this on your campus, want to define community engagement according to what looks good or what makes sense to them, or not define it, describe it in a way that really is about their disciplinary foci, that's fine, but how are we reviewing them to make sure that they're really starting to articulate what that looks like? And in a moment, I'll talk more about how you might have kind of a rubric almost to look at them. But on our campus, the university policy had to be voted on by the faculty. The rest of the policies just had to be submitted to the dean. And so it was really at that each of the dean's level. So that's a bit why you see why there's that proliferation of terms. It would have been interesting to know if we could have, for example, had a review of all the policies before they were submitted and accepted. A second implication is that, or another finding is that we had a lot of ambiguity in the university policy. And so there's a sense that that ambiguity served as a big tent to allow people to vote in the first place to accept this change in the policy. It was not incredibly threatening. Community engagement was big enough to really feel like, you know, that feels fine, right? However, there's a challenge during documentation and evaluation, like the dean said, of like, okay, so if we're going to do this, what is community engagement after all? Because this policy actually didn't give us enough information. So we do need to address cultural shifts and talk about elements around peer review, scholarly products, rigor, impact, because those are the kinds of things that folks are really kind of trying to operationalize of what does that look like? How do we know that it's going to be really good scholarship? So of course, we found disciplinary differences in the understanding. We expected it in many ways, and other studies have shown that that's also true. But we also know that departmental policies carry more weight in shaping faculty experiences in promotion and tenure and faculty life across the board, period. And that's why the next session is going to be, or one of the future sessions in the series is going to be around departmental P&T. We also saw that on our campus, we were really focused on legitimizing community engagement as a form of research. And so this was also a time that we were becoming a stronger and stronger high research activity university. So we were growing in our external funding and in our prestige and eminence measures. And so when we looked at a lot of the effort, a lot of folks seemed to put more emphasis in the scholarship or research category, and sometimes not addressing community engaged teaching at all. Engaged teaching was the one area that section that we found the fewest instances of anything around community engagement, which was interesting. And so for our campus, we're now revisiting some definitions of curricular engagement, and we're looking at community focused, community placed, community engaged, trying to get a better sense of what does community engagement look like now on our campus. And as I've said a few times now, that supplemental materials were referenced more frequently than the university policy. That meant that when departments were doing that work and their faculty were working on these policies, many times it was the community engaged faculty member who was given the task of, hey, can you help revise or write in because you know this work? So they were coming to me, to colleagues, to the resources that we were providing. And they were saying, yep, we need to have more than just what's in that university policy. So that was a really important finding. So when we look at the next questions, we wanted to know how are the terms defined and or described? So this is that question of, okay, so we change the policy. We see that there are a lot of different terms. We see that people focused on scholarship more than teaching. Now, was it community engagement? And so when we were doing this work, the research team had to go back and really look at our conceptual frameworks and define for ourselves, what do we mean by democratic civic engagement? And part of what we were looking at is that this is really about that, as well as epistemic justice, or the inclusion of many ways of knowing across many different people and the ways that they express knowledge. So we were using this framework, and so we were continuing to code and look at the ways that each of the units in their policies had started to construct this definition or description. And what we found was that, or what we ultimately came up with, was that you could look at or code each of the definitions or descriptions in three ways. And so one is that they were describing outputs. So I talked about the university policies. That's largely what it did. It said, hey, we're going to talk about the reports, the publications that were done through community engagement. And so those are activities and artifacts that were largely listed. But even departments, right, that said, that's not enough. We need to talk about more. Many of them talked about the purpose and the values, that this is for the public good, for community improvement, right? That this is part of our mission, our public mission. And then finally, some of them also talked about process. And they said that this has to be in collaboration. Community partners are included throughout the process of co-creating, that they're thought partners. And then this idea that they are part of the research team. So this was the aha for me, and I'll talk more about this and how this has informed some of our professional development. But oftentimes when I look at their definitions of community engagement, I've spent my whole career looking at definitions of community engagement and trying to define it, and then in an academic way, and then also in a like not jargony way for everyday people. And this is the most helpful thing I have experienced in a long time, because it's three. There are three things. It's not trust and reciprocity and mutual benefit, which requires me to use more words to describe them. But oftentimes with outputs, outcome, process, it helps me have a conversation about what's happening, to what end, and with whom. So when we looked at our policies, I just wanted to share that roughly a little less than a half did not have any, they had a term, but they didn't have enough information. They might have said community engaged scholarship, but then not actually had any more information that we could code to know whether it's an output, outcome, or process. So that was really interesting and a little disheartening. But then we also found that there is this colorful range of ways that departments described it according to output outcome process. Some had 2 of the 3, 1 of the 3, or 3 of the 3. So 8 of the policies actually felt that it needed to have a really thick description of community engagement, which was great. Let me get some water. So insights from this studies are that really this idea that policies should better align with principles of community engaged scholarship. And that scholarly artifacts should include outputs, outcomes, and processes. So as we're talking about like a journal article, we also need to have more information about how it was produced and who was producing it. It gave me insight into why our definitions have to be so darn long and why we need definitions, because this work is a really threefold. It's not just a single type of scholarship. That's true for really, I would say, many forms of scholarship. Relationship building between research and community members really needs to be recognized, that process. We also need to recognize non-traditional forms of knowledge production and acknowledge diverse ways of knowing. And so that's about the epistemic inclusion. And then also the idea of value and community, and including community impact, that this work is for also the community, not just academic audiences. All right, so I said that this helped me to change how I talk with people. So last week I did a workshop with faculty in our College of Visual and Performing Arts around promotion and tenure and how to craft a narrative. And so when I spoke with them, I gave them that chart and a handout that's on that QR code. I gave them a handout that was about the outputs, outcomes, and processes. And I first asked them, I said, so tell me about your community engagement. And so everybody went around and they shared. And then I talked with them about community engagement has these 3 areas. And I didn't use jargon. And everybody fully understood what it meant to talk about, different artifacts are going to be created out of community engagement. Totally makes sense. Outcomes. This is going to be for our community partners and for improving conditions or situations that we care about. And then process. We're thought partners. We're co-laborers. That totally makes sense. So then we could move into this, some more of the conversation, and this is part of the handout. So one of the challenges is that faculty often struggle to articulate their scholarly engagement coherently. So for community engaged scholars, they often come to the university and they don't have words for what they do necessarily. They don't know about community engaged scholarship, community engagement. They might be doing it, but they don't yet have a connection to what language to use. And many of them will say, Emily, I'm not sure if I'm a community engaged scholar. How do you define it? Right? So there are folks who are already doing much of this work, but they're trying to figure out, how do I talk about in the context of our campus, and particularly image management as I'm talking about promotion and tenure with my colleagues. Another challenge is that scholarship is often mistaken for service. And so this is something that when folks don't understand, they're basically using an activity to say, okay, so if you were having coffee with those folks and you were having like this kind of gathering, that's service, right? So they just define community engagement through one dimension, which is the output, or the activity, right? The artifact that you can see. And in fact, what we need to know is that oftentimes having coffee and developing that relationship is part of developing the trust and the process that you need to be able to do community engaged scholarship. You can't have the output or without the process. And so as we're thinking about how we are building our relationships, building our collaborators, that we need to be able to talk with these colleagues about when they're doing these kinds of activities, what is the outcome? What is it in service of? If it's in service of scholarship, and this relationship is literally helping you do your scholarship better, it's a scholarly activity, right? And so it needs to be represented in this more comprehensive way. Another thing I want to share about faculty struggling to articulate their scholarship coherently is that many of us, the true story is that our scholarship emerges over years, and it's not a linear path. And there are opportunities that show up out of the thin blue air, and we take them because they feel in our gut like this is a good thing to do. And maybe there's a heart connection where you say, you know what, I'm really passionate about this or this person, or I really want to be connecting with this person. I really respect them. And so their heart and their gut really lead their way in terms of their scholarship. And that happens with not just community engaged scholars, but all scholars, right? So it's never really this linear model. But in our promotion and tenure identities that we have to present in our dossiers, we have to show a really concise, structured way of how we have developed an agenda, and that this agenda has a trajectory, and that each of our activities really aligns us and keeps us going forward in a clear momentum. So we also talk about, it's hard sometimes because you're doing retrospective sense making. You're retrospectively after the fact describing what happened, which may or may not be the real case of how it really happened. And so we talked about that. So promotion, one of the challenges is that, and so to keep going through this slide and not linger too long, is that there are a lot of strategies that we talk about in terms of having someone knowledgeable share about what they see most valuable as your work. How are you telling your a narrative web by pulling together different threads so that it's part of a tapestry? And clearly define the terms of success for those who are reviewing your work. And so part of that is talking about how the outputs, the process, and the outcomes all connect. And so in many people's dossiers, you have the opportunity to talk about yourself, right? You frame what your scholarship is. And so as a community engaged scholar, you do want, just like anyone, you want to be able to, in a sentence, describe your core passion or curiosity that motivates your work. And then within that, there's going to be 2 or 3 areas that you focus on and that you can sort of create those buckets. So with faculty members, we talk about how to create those buckets. Some of those buckets of scholarship, threads, I'll say, threads of focus, involve community engagement. There are other ones that don't. There might be some areas of your work that is really just about exploring policy and doing document analysis. Well, there may be other projects and areas or threads of work that are deeply community engaged. And so by starting to talk about their different projects and mapping them out, they can start to see how they start to aggregate around these threads, and then talk about why this methodology is the most appropriate and ethical way to do this. That if I were not a community engaged scholar and I did not have these relationships and collaborators, I wouldn't be able to do this kind of work. And so in telling this story, right? So this is part of knowing what we now know about how to talk about community engagement authentically as outputs, outcomes, and processes. Walking through these narrative components will actually give the full information that one would need to be able to understand it if they don't understand community engaged scholarship, and then understand how to evaluate it. And so in the handout, there's there's 3 threads, and I go through and provide some examples. And so this is just to show it, but not to linger here for this presentation. Okay, so we also wanted to know, once we looked at the policies, right, and we're talking to people about our own work, and it's informing our understanding of what kind of work we need to be doing at UNCG as administrators. Like what's the work now? Okay, we've got the policies. Are we going to revisit them? We may at some point be able to do a little bit work, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what are the experiences of community engaged faculty? Did the promotion and tenure policy matter? And part of what I wanted to know was, early on in 2008, when I came to UNCG, part of our theory of change was, or understanding, Barbara Holland talked to us about the sort of the tidal wave of employment trends, right? That there was a large bubble of faculty who were going to be leaving in the next decade. So who are we replacing them with? And for me, that was just such a rich opportunity to think about, what if we could just recruit community engaged scholars? And then they're coming here and they are going through the ranks and going into leadership 10 years later, right? As professors, as full professors. Would that work? So in this study, I got to work with these great collaborators on the screen to interview 21 faculty members at UNCG who had come to UNCG have been at UNCG for 6 or fewer years. And so what we wanted to know was, before you came to UNCG, what were your motivations for, and like, what are your pathways to getting here? And what were the parts of UNCG that you noticed that thought like, hey, that's a place that I'd want to be? Once you were here, what was your sense of alignment? What were your experiences? And how does that affect your idea of like really retention, right? Do I want to stay here? So not surprisingly, we found that, or not surprisingly for a lot of us, is that individual motivations for community engagement are deeply personal. I think that's true for a lot of research, but I think especially we know that this is true for community engagement, and that they're shaped by experiences of family growing up and currently, their faith communities, a desire to address communities that they come from or that they're allied with. Many of them have early childhood experiences with service or with the disparities that they want to address. And then also they have been involved in community and have community experiences. And so they want to bring this into their work. So when we think about community engaged scholars and we talk about scholarship, it's really personal and it's not just, so that's why it can feel even more impactful when we support or don't support community engaged scholars. So now that diamond, when we're thinking about alignment while they're employed. So at UNCG, we wanted to know, did that, and like, what were the things that you noticed before you came and about UNCG that maybe attracted you? And so as administrator, it's very helpful to know that they did notice things like Carnegie status. So getting the Carnegie Community Engagement elective classification mattered to people. We also know that the P&T policy was something that folks talked about, that you must be serious because it's in your P&T. I knew about it before you came or when I interviewed. They also talked about broad understanding or belief that UNCG really cared about the community and also had a culture of support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those kinds of messages, if we want to recruit engaged scholars, those matter. And so a lot of the work that we do at UNCG and the institute that I direct is communications and website and newsletters and reports and all sorts of things. We also heard that department messages and practices are key. So that we've talked, I've shared, that department is really where the home is. They talked about funding and then scholarly outputs. So things that they said felt like they were supportive or not supportive. And we say, what is it that felt supportive? And they talk about funding. We got funding, there was not funding, there was less funding. Scholarly products, they are accepted or they're not, right? They're not seen as elevated. And so about half of the departments or half of the participants felt supported by the department. The other half didn't. But almost all of them, or I think all of them, said that they felt the institution cared. So it's this really important nesting experience. And then finally, we had some external factors that came into our study. And so UNCG is going through some budget shortfalls, and then the contract length of non-tenure track faculty was changed. And so that came out as indicators that community engagement was not valued, because if we're not committing to long-term contracts, then how can those individuals who are community engaged scholars commit to a long-term engagement with the community? And this concern that because of budget changes, that community engagement would be divested because the people were not going to continue to be invested in, and they couldn't trust what the future would look like. And so I talked about this. And so part of our conclusion of that study was asking, how can an institution of higher education flip this script so to speak, such that faculty are not asked how they align with the institution, but rather the institution asks how it aligns its policies, procedures, and practices at all levels, university, department, unit, to support community engaged scholars that they sought and they hired in the first place. So we've worked really hard to recruit these folks. How are we aligning with them? And so as I conclude this, I wanted to share that, beyond the policy, I've been part of a racial equity task force for our School of Health and Human Sciences. And part of that elevated or lifted up connections between equity, diversity, inclusion, our BIPOC faculty, and community engagement. We also found that as we're looking at P&T policy, we really have, because we're looking at policies to understand where might bias come in, that we need to look at the recruiting and hiring in the first place, but also the work plans and the annual reviews, because those happen year after year, and those have a really strong influence on how faculty think about their work. And then in the 7th year or 5th year or whenever it might be, when they go up for promotion and or tenure, that's when the P&T policy becomes really important. But if we think about it, those annual reviews, those work plans, that's the negotiation that's happening every year, or a contract that you have if you're on a unionized campus. That's really important. So it's not just the P&T policy, it's these other policies that we have to talk about too. When we think about beyond the P&T policy, it's also those activities that staff and colleagues can be doing in terms of workshops and consulting, in terms of talking with faculty about how to tell their narratives, celebrating the work that folks are doing, letting folks knowing what's going on, tracking, so you can be able to talk about the who, the what, the where, the why, the when, to what ends. We've got a cohort program where we have community engaged scholars and including that include community partners. They receive funding and they go through a professional development program over 3 years, develop partnerships and pathways that will eventually create goals for products that they want to be developing. And then finally, beyond the P&T policy is really thinking about how do we think about and move our campuses towards full participation, and thinking about epistemic inclusion, not only of our faculty, but the ways of knowing, and thinking about how do we help make sure that that's a part of the policies and our culture. Things that have come up for us as we're looking at DEI and promotion and tenure. So I serve on that committee now for the Faculty Senate, and we're looking at this, and these are all coming up, right? Differentiated workloads and how people are doing work that's often not recognized. That's a community engaged scholarship experience. That's a faculty of color experience. That's a person who's sitting in a discipline where they're one of few people who look like them or have the kinds of confidences that others might be seeking. And then integrated faculty role. Beyond the policy, many of us are doing work that is really hard to categorize. And so how are we helping to think of and talk about and create space for that? So are we listening? So the thing that I'm working on next is going to be listening and talking about how do we listen to ourselves, how do we listen to others, and how do we listen when we are listening to communities. And I think this entire experience for over 15 years has been about listening and trying to understand my own experience or the experience of individuals and how they are experiencing community engagement, listening to how they're negotiating and navigating their relationships with each other and what are the kinds of tensions and opportunities that come, the skills. And then community is really thinking about how are we listening when we are in community and working with community to what their priorities are and to the processes and products and outcomes that they seek. And so my last slide here is the QR code that goes to some of our materials on our website, but also our strategy at UNCG in terms of articles, white papers. Our goal has been to document this, share what we've learned, share it in peer review, share it in white papers and publications and little handouts, because we have benefited so much from others that we also include in the additional resources, because this is a community of scholars, of scholar administrators, who are going to be instrumental to faculty and the efforts that they may have for promotion and tenure. So this is really, everybody is needed in this work, and I feel really grateful to be able to share a little bit about our journey. So I'm going to stop sharing and invite Lauren.
Thank you, Emily. Let me just say thank you for everyone, I assume, who's on the webinar, for sharing your story and the lessons learned and how this work is continuing to evolve. I'll let you take a drink of water before maybe launching into a bit of Q&A. And we'll just remind folks, there have been some questions in the Q&A, which I'll facilitate, and we can talk through, Emily. But if you continue to have questions or just thinking of them now, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Or if you want to raise a hand and turn your video on and speak with Emily directly, definitely can do that. But we'll launch into just the first question that I think really is very broad and reflecting on your entire presentation. And this is something that I feel like I see a lot of campuses trying to think about or think through in terms of when to take movement or when to take action on this work, right? It's kind of like a chicken and egg, right? It's not necessarily, there is one definitive step that you have to take first, and this is the way that you do it. But I do see a lot of campuses kind of stalling in a point, like not sure if they're ready to make advances in this work, or really what to do first. So just the larger questions in larger question in reflecting on the past 10-15 years of your work here, if you could guide this process again or look back, like would you reprioritize or reorder steps, recognizing that the context at UNC Greensboro is very unique and different, but how would you, if at all, kind of reorder or rethink the way that either you launched into this work or the steps that you've taken subsequently?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, when to take action. I think I said earlier on that there are folks who are waiting for like the president, right, to be on board and to say, okay, the president needs to help like revise things, or it's and the president, and what I hear in spaces with presidents, they say, oh, we could never touch PNT. That's the faculty's realm. And so the faculty, so they're sort of like, pointing to like whose job is it? So I would say that like just point to yourself and say like, okay, I can start here. And what that means is that you're not by yourself doing this work, but it may be a staff member, if you're a staff member and you're really committed to this work, that you're able to start to have conversations with faculty, with administrators, and start to build coalitions, right? What I'll say is at UNCG, it started because one person was in the chair of the faculty senate and was able to task or the committee to look into it. So can you look into community engagement? This has come up as something that we want to take on. It wasn't just that one person, of course, right? There were many other people that had been around. There had been a service learning faculty fellow who had a course release one year to think about community engagement and promotion and tenure, and to write like I think it was like a 5-page letter, maybe it's a little longer, that she shared around, but it was based on interviews and conversations. So I guess what I'm saying is that you take action. I think it's really helpful if you're going to actually change promotion and tenure, you do need to get into the faculty senate, right? Or to the folks who have the power to open up a policy and examine it. But it's also possible to discuss the policy and how it is interpreted, because oftentimes, without even opening it, right? So we can talk about the policy in faculty senate or other places without touching it, because oftentimes community engagement may not be recognized explicitly, but I think it's often, there may be more room for it than we expect there may be, if that makes sense. So it's interpretation and culture of how we look at the terms and the words that are in there. I do wish, in terms of taking action, that there had been more concurrent professional development. So a lot of the work got done before we had a lot of folks for the university policy, before we had as many conversations and consultants and workshops come on campus to really develop it. And so in that way, I think that it could have benefited from more national conversations rather than that group feeling like they needed to write something. Not that they didn't look at national things, but I think the field was still pretty nascent. So yeah, it's hard to know when, but I would say you do want to, it's little fires that kind of, you know, or they're like little, maybe fires aren't helpful right now, but thinking about all the little things that bubble up and create more of an impact. I think each one matters, but I do think you need to get someone there.
Yeah, this kind of launches into the next question that was a part of the chat or the discussion while you were presenting. And I feel like campuses that are many campuses, at least in my perspective, that are launching into this work are often very siloed, right, in terms of how they do things, or certain departments or units are more on board or more understanding or more into these types of initiatives, right? So wanting to not just prioritize the steps of this work, but thinking like, how do you, let's see, what are the approaches or how to handle certain aspects when they're siloed. So one of the questions in the chat that just came in was, and please feel free to unmute or to share if you want to give a little bit more context. So this is from, I just had it up, I'm sorry. Someone in the chat that I didn't, Allison, yes, Allison. So Allison was saying that their campus, or well, at least she was surprised that there weren't in your kind of like word cloud or word bubble, that service learning classes or experiential learning wasn't pulled into that. And she was specifically wondering how, because they have pulled their service learning classes or their experiential learning within their gen ed curriculum under like the umbrella of community engagement. Is that something that is siloed that shouldn't be, right? How, when thinking through the smaller or more granular steps of this change, is that something that you think folks should be attentive to? I hope I'm doing your question justice.
Yeah, I think it's, Allison, if you wanted to unmute, that's fine too. And I will try to respond in the way that I understand your question. I don't think it's a problem that community engagement is like under experiential learning. I do think it's about the definition, right? Of like, are we really honoring the kind of like mutual benefit, reciprocity, asset-based, or my new language that I'm using is like, is it really, when we're looking at it, would we be able to say that it has the processes and the outcomes that we would expect that are like that have fidelity to that practice? And so oftentimes when you're looking at institutional priorities, if experiential learning is like the priority and that's the term and that's the language, you can go with that and you can kind of hook your wagon to that. But you do want to make sure that when you're doing that, that there's clear enough definitions of service learning as one of the experiential education opportunities is unique from others, right? In the sense that it is working with members in the community for public good through collaborative reciprocal processes for mutual benefit or something like that. So I do think we needed to define it. The other thing that can be really helpful is if there's some sort of documents where they're defining experiential learning, so that and what those different things are, that you're really clear about, that people could go to that as like a key almost to say, okay, what did we mean by experiential learning? What makes it experiential? What's service learning, or what's community engagement?
So I'm going to pull back a bit because that was a very specific question, right? I'm going to pull back into a question that was asked a little earlier in the session when you were talking about like the Engagement Academy bringing speakers to campus, trying to kind of like get folks on the same page in terms of all of the things that go into this. Alexis in the chat asked your thoughts specifically about a multi-campus approach to this work, specifically about like the Engagement Academy and the Speaker System series, but recognizing that it seems like a lot of folks on this call are part of a university or institution that's a part of a larger system, and recognizing that UNC Greensboro is as well. Would love to hear your perspectives or thoughts on approaching this work from a multi-campus approach, be it, you know, within a system or just a regional collection of universities, and kind of what that entails.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of that I didn't get into was that at the time that UNCG changed its guidelines, so we're one of 16 universities and colleges that are part of the UNC University of North Carolina system. At that time, the president of our system was interested in community engaged scholarship, public engagement, really talking about how can we make the residents of North Carolina fall back in love with its institutions of higher education. And so there was at the system level a UNC engagement council. And so there was a representative from each of the campuses that would get together, and we would have conversations about community engagement. We had few symposia. Our chancellor shared the work that we had done around promotion and tenure at that symposia. So that was really, really, really helpful because it helped our chancellor in particular. So at our institution level, it's a chancellor. It helped our chancellor feel like this was something that she ought to support, because it felt like the system cared about this. And so I don't know that we needed that, but I think that it really, really helped that she felt very confident that this is something that other chancellors and the president of the system would look favorably upon. And that also being said, many of us would go to our regional meetings like North Carolina Campus Engagement and talk with each other about what's happening on our campuses. And then we would even sometimes like bring the speaker to our campus who was speaking at that conference, right? Because they're local in the region. And so we could bring them and they could do workshops or things like that. So I think sharing those resources is really key. But if you're in a system and you can get someone at the system level just to convene a community engagement council of people who get to talk to each other, and then you could talk about this, I think that could be powerful. Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I hear that answer is wherever you can generate buy-in, go for it, right? And that was looking at the questions specifically that were posed in the registration when folks registered and had specific questions about this topic. I kind of boiled those down to, they kind of themed to like two very distinct groups of questions, right? But generating buy-in and ways to do that and think about this. And then also the evaluation of this work, specifically engaged research. So that kind of makes me think the question right now in that Jennifer just asked in the Q&A, I think definitely lumps into the buy-in category, right? How do you generate buy-in for this work? Recognizing that she specifically asked that community engagement professionals or administrative staff often have more time, resource, or, you know, I don't want to say ability, but time essentially to dedicate to this work. But folks trust or feel more comfortable if faculty lead these efforts. So recognizing that you straddle both of those identities, would love to hear you speak a bit to, I mean, how are some ways to address that, right? How do you balance both faculty and staff voices in this, recognizing that a lot of the wheels get pushed by administrators who have more time to dedicate to this work?
Yeah. So one of the things that we did is that we brought like researchers to UNCG. And so throughout the years, we would choose people who are doing really cool research or scholarship as community engaged researchers. And so they would be part of our community engaged speaker series. And then people would see research that they're like, that's cool research. That's really well done. Maybe it's being done by an R1 person, you know, so we could start being an R2 and prestige, you know, all that good stuff, that we could bring those people in. And then people would start to be like, oh, that's community engaged scholarship. Yeah, that's cool. You're doing a great job. So when we look at evaluating research, you're doing it in like in a like cultural way where you're observing it, you're sort of feeling that this is a cool thing to do and that people who you respect are doing it well. So that helps, I think, and part of that culture of evaluating it and looking favorably on it. I also am putting in the link, a link to one of our publications. We did a 5-day intensive dialogue with Barbara Holland. We brought her to our campus. We talked to over 100 people. And we grouped them according to sort of like disciplinary area so that people who are in humanities weren't with natural scientists, right? That they were kind of in their own collection because then they have similar cultures, artifacts, things like that. And so we talked about how has the university changed as one of our openers, which was really helpful to show how different experiences how people have different experiences of the university and what research looks like and what and how we evaluate, but also many other things. And so then we talked about case examples and said, how would you evaluate this scholar? What kind of information would you need to know? So we went through and practiced with them, looking at a sample dossier and saying, how would you evaluate this? What kind of questions do you have? And then a lot of them recognize how hard this work is. And that you would need other people outside of academic peers to give you a sense of like, is this, peer review got opened, right? And so many of the things that we recommend in that document are things that were elicited through those conversations of what kind of information would you need to have? And so the final thing I would say is that, the standards of community engaged research are high quality ones that are also aligned with the standards of high quality research and scholarship. And so that's where like the Glassick Huber Mayeroff work is really helpful because a lot of people who are on promotion and tenure committees, like they didn't get their PhD in higher ed like I did, right? So like, I know how higher ed works. I study, I study all this stuff. They're just showing up and they're like, okay, like, how is it, it's a more limited view in terms of what like their experience with lots of different kinds of a scholarship are, right? So I am able to have a different kind of view. And so I think when we look at it, we need to help them understand that there are people who study scholarship and standards and like what this is. And I think that was one of the most helpful things was sharing with them how community engaged research and traditional research are actually can be evaluated in similar ways, but you have to ask additional questions like the outputs, the process, the outcome.
Thank you. I feel like we have time for maybe one more question. We don't have any, at least that I've seen, bubble up right now in the chat or in the Q&A, but we'll ask one that maybe that you didn't touch fully on in terms of like of what you just shared. And this kind of goes back to what you were just speaking about, the evaluation of engagement. And I'm going to couch this in the larger questions of like, where does this work go from here, specifically from your context of UNCG, right? What does the next 10 to 15 years look like? Because this question specifically asks about thinking about non-traditional forms of scholarship in policies, but also as those non-traditional forms evolve and change. So this question specifically referencing open access, which is fairly new, work that's AI generated or has parts of AI within it. So what does the evolution of this work look like, couched in that very specific example? But yeah, how does this work continue to grow and evolve in the nitty-gritty of new methodologies or outputs and outcomes that come out of this work, but also more broadly in terms of your work at UNCG?
Yeah, I think throughout the time that I've been at UNCG, I've also been a part of things talking about kind of like the modernization of scholarship. So the next speaker is going to be amazing to talk about this because they're talking about some of this work. But what I've needed to talk about is that it's not just community engaged scholarship that is modernizing forms of scholarship like digital media, blogs, like all these things that are no longer tied to a printing press. Right. So when you think about like what are traditional measures of scholarship, they're all tied to like this idea that there's a printing press somewhere that there's a person who is the publisher, right? And that there's very few people who have access. And because it's very limited, it's very precious. And they have the microphone, they have the distribution links or lines. With with the explosion and the broad use of technology and different platforms to share your own research and disseminate it yourself, we now have really important different kinds of formats of scholarship. So it's not just open scholarship, but just forms of scholarship. And so I think that's been really important to talk with folks, that this isn't a community engagement issue, that I'm trying to get a white paper approved, because humanities are also trying to get compilations of art or whatever it might be approved also for open access kinds of things. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that as well as I want to. So with open access, I also think that we're getting better and better at curating information in different groups of information. So like Civic Leads was one of the open access platforms. There's other ones that are trying to help people sort of find like, hey, if you liked this kind of study, or if you're interested in community engagement, you might like these other ones as well. So I think there's a lot more curation around open access and open scholarship. I think preprints are going to continue to be something in our future for community engagement and more broadly. So I work a lot with our library and the research office as we're looking at data and open data and what's happening with NIH and NSF and others, and how that aligns with community engagement as well, with the idea of how do we make sure that data sets are open and available to our community partners? And then how do we also help support the technology in terms of helping community partners actually be able to use that data? So I think it's open access, but it's open data, not only open journals and texts, but data. I think it's going to be one of our big things. And we're going to have to figure out how to evaluate that. And so in the open scholarship conversations I've been a part of with APLU and NSF, there's a public accelerating public use of research data, APARD. They're working on issues around faculty recognition also, and how do you evaluate data and data sets and impact of data.
Well, recognizing the time and the fact that we've been here, for almost 90 minutes, and want to be respectful of everyone's time, we can kind of end it there. And I just again will say thank you, Emily, for sharing your perspectives, the very outlined and concrete stuff that you have taken at UNCG, or all of UNCG has taken. I think it's really inspiring to those who are kind of in different phases of this work, and then looking ahead that there's always going to be ways that will evolve and iterate on this work. So thank you for sharing. I'll also just shamelessly put in another plug for the second session that has been referenced here. So on February 5th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern, will be our next session looking at promising promotion and tenure reforms for societally impactful research, strategies and opportunities. So that will be the next kind of session like this that we'll host. But again, just want to say thank you to Emily and every one of my colleagues who helped to organize this today. Happy to stay on a little bit if folks have more specific questions, or specifically about the next sessions or things that didn't get addressed. But thank you everyone for joining. We will see you in February. If